The roast chicken was dry, but I ate it anyway. Lenora had cooked, and no one dared say a word about the meat being stringy. Ezra sat at the head of the table carving slices like he was the patriarch of a dynasty. Nara barely touched her plate. She'd grown quieter over the past year, and I'd learned not to press. It was one of those Sunday lunches where the air felt just a bit too heavy, the kind where everyone showed up out of duty, not warmth. I brought my own coleslaw like I always did. No one touched it but me. Ezra poured himself a second glass of iced tea and muttered something about the rising utility bills. I looked up and asked gently, "You paid the gas last week, right?" He didn't even pause. "Don't worry about it, Mom. You're not paying for anything. You're just here." Silence. A long, stretching silence. Then, with his fork still in his hand, he chuckled. "Honestly, you're just a useless old woman now." No offense. Lenora looked down. No one laughed. I didn't say a word. I just nodded. Once picked up my spoon and went back to my soup. I focused on the warmth, the salt, the way the carrot softened against the roof of my mouth. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. When I stood to clear my plate, no one stopped me. I walked back to the guest house behind the main property, the one I'd helped wire with my own hands when Ezra bought the land. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, shoes still on. I didn't feel rage. I felt emptied, like someone had slowly turned a valve and drained something from me I didn't know I'd been holding on to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the wind creak through the eaves, felt the cold settle through the window glass. My pillowcase smelled faintly of detergent and old copper. The next morning, I brewed coffee at 5, stood in the doorway, and stared out toward the street. The sun hadn't risen yet, but something else had. The morning after the lunch, I swept the porch, slowly letting the bristles scratch against the wood like a rhythm I could control. Ezra didn't say good morning when he passed me on his way to the garage. He glanced once, then looked past me like I was part of the railing. By 10, I'd already tightened the faucet in the outdoor sink and resealed the caulking around the guest house windows. Things no one asked me to do. Things no one noticed. But that's how it had always been. From inside the main house through the half-open kitchen window, I heard Lenora's voice. Sharp, hurried. She's just there. Like a decoration, or an appliance that doesn't work anymore. Someone laughed faintly, Ezra, I think. The sound landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I pressed my hand against the warm wood of the fence and let the sting settle. Back inside the guest house, I opened the drawer under the stove and pulled out the old plumbing wrench I hadn't used in years. The handle was worn smooth. I used to keep it in my truck back when I worked full-time. Back when Ezra would ride beside me with his knees bouncing, pointing out squirrels and radio towers. I carried it into the bathroom and got to work. The sink had been leaking for months, not badly, but just enough to need attention. I tightened the valve, sealed the drip. When I finished, I stood over the sink for a moment and caught my own reflection. The woman looking back at me didn't look broken, just paused. That night, I sat in my chair with a notebook in my lap and a pen in my hand. I wrote down the grocery list I didn't need, and under it a single line Ezra doesn't remember. I folded the paper and slid it into the back of the drawer where I keep my birth certificate and the house documents, the ones that still have my name listed first. The next day, I pulled out the old coffee tin from under the sink and wiped the dust from its lid. The coffee tin was cold in my hands. I sat cross-legged on the rug, the same one I'd hauled back from a garage sale 15 years ago, and lifted the lid. Inside were folded papers, receipts curled at the edges, and an old brass key that didn't open anything anymore. At the very bottom, beneath a faded bus schedule and a photo of Ezra as a toddler holding a plastic wrench, I found the deed. It was exactly where I left it, slightly stained, still crisp at the corners. My name clear in black ink. Cimbria Lot primary owner. I had forgotten how heavy a single piece of paper could feel. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the day I signed it. My husband had already passed. Ezra was 18. We'd scraped together every penny from my side jobs and his part-time shifts at the grocery store. I did the wiring, the tiling, even dug out the fence posts myself. Every time someone said I couldn't do it, I added another hour of work. I didn't have the luxury of rest. I had built this house not just in the way of hammer and nail, but with sacrifice stitched between every floorboard. I remembered Ezra's little feet running barefoot on the tiles, the way he used to call it our castle. Now he walked past me like I was drywall. I slid the deed back into its folder and tucked it into the back of the drawer behind the stove. Not hidden, just resting. That night, I heard Ezra complaining again. Through the thin walls, his voice reached me like it always did. She's not even paying rent. Why does she still have a say in anything I didn't move? I didn't cry. I folded towels. I stacked the ones with frayed edges on top. And when the morning came, I walked 2 blocks down to Mr. Bexley's locksmith shop. His bell above the door still jingled the same way it had when I was 35. Mr. Bexley was already behind the counter when I walked in, polishing a lock cylinder with a small rag. He looked up, squinted a moment, then smiled, the way only someone who's known your whole story can. "Well, I'll be Miss Cimbria Lott," he said. "What brings you in?" I placed both hands on the counter. "I need a full set. Front-back garage. Deadbolts too." He didn't ask questions. Not yet. Just nodded slowly and pulled out a catalog from beneath the register. I pointed to a sturdy brushed nickel model, something quiet and unassuming, but strong. We worked in silence, the kind that doesn't itch. By the time he was boxing up the final set, he finally asked, "Everything all right out there at the house?" I pressed the cash into his palm. "I just want to make sure what's mine stays mine." He nodded. Once the way a man nods when he's been there. Back home, I waited until the sun had started its descent. Ezra and Lenora had taken Nara out for dinner. I watched their taillights disappear down the street before I opened the box. The locks came off one by one. My hands knew what to do. The rhythm returned easily. Unscrew, replace, test, twist. Each click of a newly secured bolt sounded cleaner than the last. When I reached the garage, I paused. That space still held the workbench I'd built when Ezra was 12. He had helped stain the wood, carefully wearing gloves 3 sizes too big. Now it smelled like neglect and antifreeze. I changed the garage lock anyway. By the time they returned, I was sitting on the porch of the guest house, wiping my palms with an old shop rag. Ezra's key didn't fit. He jiggled it, confused, then called out Mom. I didn't stand. I didn't explain. I just said, calm and even. The locks are changed. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. I watched him process it, his mouth opening, closing. That night, I printed a small sign and taped it inside the main front window. Home is earned. Respect required for entry. The next morning, I pulled my hair back, buttoned the navy blouse I hadn't worn in a year, and walked to Trish Gable's office downtown. Her name was still painted in gold on the window above the law firm door. We'd gone to high school together back when girls weren't supposed to handle tools or legal briefs. We both had something to prove back then. Trish looked up from her desk and smiled as I stepped inside. "You finally ready?" she asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. I nodded. "I want everything in writing. The house, the will, everything." She pushed her coffee aside and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Tell me what's going on." I kept it simple. No drama, no names, just facts. That I built the house, that I'm still the legal owner, that I've been disrespected in it long enough, that I needed to make sure no one could sell it out from under me or lock me out of my own legacy. Trish nodded through most of it, lips tight, eyes steady. She'd heard versions of this before, from mothers' widows, grandmothers erased in the homes they helped raise. But when I slid the deed across the table, her eyebrows lifted. "Well," she said, "this makes it a whole lot easier." We drafted a living will that morning. I named no one in the inheritance, not Ezra, not Lenora. I left a placeholder for future designation. I signed my name without hesitation. Watching the ink dry, I felt something shift, like metal plates in my spine realigning. We added a property clause, no changes, sales transfers, or mortgage applications without my written consent. Not even a nail in the wall, unless I said yes. When I left the office, the wind felt sharper on my face, but it didn't sting. I walked home steady. Ezra was in the driveway when I returned. Phone pressed to his ear. He looked up and narrowed his eyes at the envelope in my hand. I didn't stop, just brushed past and said, "Legal delivery." For me. That evening, I folded the papers and placed them beside the wrench in the coffee tin. 2 mornings later, Ezra knocked on the guesthouse door. It was too polite to be casual, too soft to be sincere. I opened it anyway. He stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside without saying a word. He didn't sit, just lingered near the bookshelf, scanning the photos, like he was surprised they were still there. Pictures of him in braces, muddy boots, birthday hats. This whole lock thing he began wasn't necessary. We could have just talked. I raised an eyebrow. "You talked plenty last Sunday." He sighed through his nose. "That wasn't look, I didn't mean it like that. You said what you meant." His eyes darted to the window. "It's just, Lenora and I have been stretched thin. The mortgage, Nara's school, her allergies, there's pressure, Mom." I folded my arms. "You think pressure just started with your generation?" His mouth tightened, and for a second, he looked like the boy who once begged me to fix his science fair volcano the night before it was due. "I'm not trying to fight," he said quietly. "I just want to know what this is." "A punishment." "No," I said. "It's a correction." He looked at me for a long moment like he didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. "I have a legal clause now," I continued. "Nothing in this house changes unless I approve it. No refinancing, no sale, not even a repaint." He looked stunned. "You think we'd try to sell the house out from under you? I think people act differently when they stop seeing someone as part of the foundation." He swallowed. "Lenora's been... She thinks maybe it's better if you had your own place. You know, a senior condo. Somewhere with nurses nearby." I let the words hang in the air, let them sour before I answered. "Tell her she'll need a key to get that idea through the front door." And as he walked away, I picked up the house keys from the counter and slid them deep into my coat pocket. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm tea and a yellow pad of paper. I drew columns, wrote down names, scratched some out. The inheritance placeholder Trish left had stayed blank too long. I thought of Nara. Soft-spoken eyes always reading something beyond the room. She once slipped a note under my pillow that read, "I'm glad you're here." But she was still just a child, too easily swayed by the voices around her. Instead, I wrote down the name of the community tool library I'd volunteered with years ago, the one that fixed bicycles for kids on weekends and hosted Fix-It Fridays for seniors who couldn't afford plumbers. They could use the house someday, the land too, build something good, something earned. I made an appointment with Trish for the following week, then slid the notepad back into the drawer. The next morning, I baked banana bread. Not for Ezra. Not to make peace. I just wanted the smell of something warm in the air again. Something mine. Lenora passed through the yard that afternoon. She didn't say hello, just picked at her phone as she crossed the flagstones, muttering into the screen. Later that evening, I heard the sound of keys jingling a door handle, turning a frustrated grunt. Ezra, trying the back door again. He hadn't asked. I hadn't offered. He stormed away after a minute, and I watched from the guest house window as he paced under the porch light. There was no satisfaction in it, just silence. After he disappeared inside, I stepped out into the cool night air and walked the perimeter of the house, checking each door, each lock, each window latch. Everything still held. Back inside, I wrapped the banana bread in wax paper and placed it beside the coffee tin. Then I pulled out the envelope Trish had given me and carefully wrote on the back in bold block letters, "Final addendum, witnessed transfer." And before the sun rose the next day, I placed a call to a friend I hadn't spoken to in a decade, back when we'd both still been strong enough to swing hammers side by side. By the time Everett rolled up in his dented silver truck, the sky was still pink behind the sycamores. He stepped out slowly, brushing dust from his overalls, and grinned at me like we'd only paused the conversation yesterday. "You still drinking that tar you called coffee?" he asked. "Only when I need to stay sharp," I replied, handing him a mug. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. I handed him the schematics I'd drawn, a few simple changes to the guest house reinforced deadbolts, a second layer of drywall new shelving for legal files, and a heavy oak cabinet that could be locked from the inside. By noon, we had stripped the guest house entry down to its studs. The old wood smelled like the past sun-baked summers, Ezra's soccer gear, my husband's pipe smoke. We built quietly, carefully. Everett was slower than he used to be, and so was I, but our hands remembered. When he braced the cabinet frame, I measured twice. When I hammered, he held steady. Between drilling, he nodded toward the house. "That boy of yours still talking sideways." "Less talking now," I said. "More avoiding." He gave a low hum like a man who's seen this pattern before. When we broke for lunch, I brought out sandwiches wrapped in cloth napkins. He didn't say much, just tapped his fingers against the wood grain of the table and looked at the trees. "You ever think you'd be fighting for your place like this?" he asked. I shook my head. "But I'm not fighting. I'm building." We finished the last coat of sealant just before dusk. I paid him with cash and half the banana bread. As he packed up his tools, he nodded toward the porch. "You got everything you need." I tightened the final hinge. "I do now." That evening, I slid the revised will and transfer paperwork into the new cabinet, locked it, and placed the key in a tin tucked beneath the sink, beside the wrench and the oldest receipt for the house. Then I turned off the porch light and set a motion sensor in its place. The first flash came just after 3 a.m. A sudden burst of white across the yard, followed by a hollow clatter near the side gate. I was already awake. Some part of me always was these days. I didn't turn on any lights. I simply sat up, slid my feet into my slippers, and waited. 30 seconds later, the motion sensor tripped again. This time I heard voices. Low, urgent. Ezra's, and Lenora's. I opened the drawer beside my bed, took out the small flashlight, and moved through the dark to the back door. I didn't open it. I just listened. "She has the paperwork," Lenora hissed. "Everything's locked. If we don't do something now, Ezra cut her off. Just help me boost over the gate. I'll pry the cabinet. She's probably asleep." I leaned against the frame and let out a slow, steady breath. So, that was the plan. I walked to the new oak cabinet in the guest house and opened it with my spare key. I removed nothing. Just left the door slightly ajar. Then I stepped outside into the cool air, crossed the stone path, and waited in the shadows near the arbor. It didn't take long. Ezra's hand appeared first, then his shoe, then the rest of him swung over the fence like he was 16 again. Lenora stayed behind. He crept toward the guest house door, using his phone as a dim guide. When he opened it, the sensor inside clicked, illuminating the room in a wash of cold blue light. I stepped forward, quiet but clear. I wouldn't. Ezra froze. I flicked on my flashlight. Catching his pale face, the cabinet opened behind him. His mouth opened, but no words came. Trish notarized the documents, I said. There are digital backups. Motion footage saves to cloud. He lowered his arm slowly. I just wanted to... No, I said. You wanted control. The porch light flicked on again behind me. Another sensor, picking up Lenora now standing in the grass caught like a deer. I turned away without another word and walked back inside to call the sheriff. The sheriff arrived just after 4 headlights casting long beams across the yard. I met him at the gate, already holding the USB drive with the footage. He didn't ask many questions, just took my statement, nodded solemnly, and knocked gently on the main house door. Ezra answered in a t-shirt and socks, his face still flushed from the cold and shame. Lenora stood behind him, with her arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. The sheriff didn't arrest anyone. That wasn't the point. He made it clear this was now a matter of legal record trespass, attempted interference with notarized property documents, and violation of protective entry terms. He handed Ezra a copy of the report and tipped his hat to me on the way out. By sunrise, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I walked the perimeter, checked the locks, and rearmed the sensors. Then I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, stronger than usual, and sat at the guest house table watching the sun rise. They didn't speak to me that day. Not one word. But something had shifted. By dinner, the energy in the house had curdled. Nara avoided my eyes at the table. Lenora scraped her fork against the plate in long, silent lines. Ezra cleared his throat more times than necessary. Afterward, I stood in the doorway and waited. Finally, Ezra looked up. I suppose we won't be living here much longer, he said. I didn't blink. That's your choice. The locks stay. Lenora muttered something about lawyers and slammed her napkin down. Nara flinched. I turned to my granddaughter and smiled softly. You'll always be welcome. You know that. She nodded, biting her lip. She understood more than they thought. Later that night, I added one final note to the document packet in the cabinet. A letter addressed to Nara, sealed and dated. Just in case. Then I climbed into bed, pulled the quilt to my chest, and for the first time in months, I slept with the door unlocked. Not because I trusted them, but because I trusted myself.